So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for an introduction to the Outdoor School Cultural Responsiveness Self-Evaluation Tool, which you will probably hear us call the CRSET many times in this webinar. So that's what we mean when we say CRSET, we're referring to this tool. We'd like to thank you for taking the time to join us live, or if you're watching the webinar recording of this after the fact, thanks for taking the time to do that. So I'm going to start with a quick introduction to some of the features that are available on a Zoom webinar. The first I'll call your attention to is the chat. So that's where we'll be pasting resources and links that you may be interested in clicking on. You can also type into the chat if you want to get into contact with just the panelists, or if you want to share something with panelists and attendees. And so you'll have that option to select which audience you want your chat to be visible to. And then I'll also draw your attention to the Q&A function. So this is where you can ask questions that will be visible just to the panelists that we can go through and answer as we go through the webinar. So if, as we're going through the tool, you have questions that come up, we encourage you to enter those into the Q&A so that we can make sure that we get those questions answered. We'll answer as many as we possibly can here in the webinar today. And if you have so many questions that we can't quite get to them all, we will add them to a frequently asked questions page on our website. And so I will let you get into touch with us via the chat or the Q&A if you have any trouble, and we will get started here. So we're going to begin by introducing our team who's been working on this tool. I'll start. I'm Christy Bakke. I use she, her, hers pronouns. We're each going to share a tiny bit about our identities, just so you have a better sense of who was involved on the team making this tool. So I'm a white woman. I'm actually new to Oregon. So this is sort of my first year of experience with Outdoor School. I moved here from North Carolina, where I was a researcher and entomologist, and have really always been sort of engaged in thinking about who's being sort of left out of the conversations that we're having. And I've really started thinking more about that in the last few years. And so I was really excited to sort of put some of that way of thinking to work here on this tool. And I'm also the curriculum and professional development coordinator for the Outdoor School team. And so I will pass it on to Sharzi.
Good morning, everybody. My name is CRSET Jones, though most people call me Sharzi. I am a queer Dutch Creole, Dutch Caribbean, South American, cisgender Black immigrant woman. I've been here in Oregon for about 4.5 years, but I've been working in the outdoor education, environmental education field for a while now. And this work, specifically thinking about culturally responsiveness in this field, has been really important to me, thinking about myself and the identities that I hold and how I show up into spaces, either despite of programming or because of programming that's happening there. So I'm really excited about what our team has been able to create for you all. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the Outreach and Inclusion Coordinator for the Oregon State University Extension Service Outdoor School Program. And I'll pass it on to Steve.
Hi everyone, Steve Braun. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm a white, cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied male with a background in positivist epistemology. So science in quantitative terms, which often gets a lot of value. I have a background in special education and restoration ecology, and engage with the Outdoor School program as an evaluator and consultant. And I'll just say that the process of really taking a deep dive into culturally responsive evaluation has been an amazing learning opportunity for me. And over again, I'm at my learning edge. And as we go forward, we invite all of you to sit in your learning edge too. And I'll pass it to Spirit.
Nioke, Dr. Spirit Brooks, Nahashitna, that's good morning. Welcome, thank you for being here in my native language, Arapaho. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I identify as an Indigenous woman, as a mother, as an educator. I've lived in Oregon most of my adult life, but grew up in a migrant family. So I went to 11 different public schools before I was a high school dropout. So I dropped out of high school as a junior. In spite of that, I was the first one in my family to go to college and the only one in my family to complete a PhD. So I'm always really proud to introduce myself as Dr. Spirit. I'm a diasporic white passing Native woman, so an enrolled citizen of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes of Oklahoma. On my father's side. So our traditional homelands were what is now northern Colorado and southern Wyoming. My father's family was relocated from our traditional homelands after the 1867 Medicine Lodge Treaty to first Kansas and then to Oklahoma to allotment lands or reservation. And my father's family were the Pedleys and the Kinneys. My grandparents were boarding school educated and lost their language and gained Christianity. So one of the things that I've done through COVID, one of the things I've done for myself is to revisit learning my native language. And while I only know a few words, I feel like that's definitely a decolonial practice that I've embraced. So after the Relocation Act of 1954, my grandparents left Oklahoma and resettled in Southern California. My mother's family, the white side of my family, are Irish and Roma Sinti or ethnic German. My grandmother on my mother's side was sent to the US in 1938 to live with family and escape Hitler. And then my grandfather on my maternal side are the son of, he was the son of Irish immigrants. So I am the OSU Extension Service Outdoor School Programs Research, Evaluation, and Assessment Coordinator. And I'm going to turn my camera off, not because I don't want to engage with you all, but because like many folks these days have kind of unstable internet access and don't want to lose everyone through the webinar. So one of the best practices that we've embraced with the Outdoor School program is the idea that land acknowledgement is very important to our work. So today we'd like to begin the webinar and frame our day together by acknowledging that we, those of us in the Willamette Valley at least, are on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Kalapuya peoples who are represented within the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, as well as the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, which is composed of Takelma, Umpqua, Molalla, Rogue River, Kalapuya, and Shasta bands. They've lived on the lands that we call home here in the Willamette Valley since time immemorial. As well, we'd like to acknowledge the lands of the people of the Portland Metro, where some of you are joining us from today, and recognize that Portland's Native community is very diverse and vibrant and is descended from over 380 tribes, and that many Native folks in Portland are multi-ethnic and multi-tribal. So the Portland metro area lies on the traditional homelands of the Multnomah, the Cowlitz, the Wasco, the Cathlamet, the Clackamas, bands of Chinook, the Tualatin Kalapuya, the Molalla, and many other tribes who made and continue to make their homes along the Columbia River. I also want to acknowledge that some of you are joining us from Eastern and Southern Oregon, so current homes to the Confederated Tribes of Umatilla, the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, Burns Paiute, and the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Indians. So in acknowledging that all outdoor education takes place on Indigenous homeland, and in taking the time to consider the settler colonial legacy of displacement and settlement, we acknowledge the long and most importantly, continuous relationship with the lands on which we gather for meetings, even virtual. So in the act of recognitions of the legacy of violence, genocide, and forced assimilation that continues to this day, we may start to take some level of responsibility. And as we think about the context of our work today, and we consider how we as an outdoor school community can continue to be of service to Indigenous youth and communities of the state, land acknowledgement is a really important way to recognize and respect Indigenous peoples of Oregon and how they continue to survive and persevere and continue to take care of the land. So we pay respects to ancestors and elders past and present. So we're modeling this land acknowledgement for you today, and it's an invitation for all of you to consider how a land acknowledgement might be a first step rather than an only step. And some of the positive aspects of land acknowledgement are upsetting sort of this idea of terra nullius, we say, or free and empty land, like the land wasn't occupied before white settlement when it was. It reminds us that Indigenous people continue to persevere and survive. It reminds us that while colonized, we have a responsibility to respect Indigenous peoples, and it combats erasure and forces us as settlers to recognize our positionality. We want to be careful, though, when we do land acknowledgements, that we are not consigning Indigenous peoples to the past, that it isn't just a box ticking activity that isn't accompanied by any sort of action, and that people feel they can take this action of land acknowledgement and not do anything else, and that absolves them of any further responsibility. So I would invite you, if you do decide to incorporate land acknowledgement into your practice as an outdoor educator, I would invite you to think of it as a first step rather than an only step in starting to build relationships with Native communities in your regions.
Okay, thank you for that, Spirit. And to get us started into thinking about our tool that we're going to be talking about today, I want to talk to you all about the quadrants of equity, inclusion, and diversity work. So today, the tool that we are hoping to introduce you to is one step in your organization's process of working towards more equitable and inclusive outdoor school experiences. And this work can feel very amorphous and overwhelming. The Avarna group calls it the blob, and they have a really great article that Spirit put into the chat for you all called Tackling the Blob, where they provide this framework to help organizations think about moving forward. This framework breaks down the equity, diversity, and inclusion, or EDI work, into 4 quadrants based on whether it's organizational or individual, and whether it's internal or external. Next slide. So in this institutional and external space is where we'll find the work that an organization puts out for their constituents or participants. And this is just the work that happens to be public or semi-public. It includes marketing, programming, and advocacy work that impacts your participants and constituents and could also impact the broader public. Next slide. In the individual and external quadrant is the space where we'll find the work that an individual does within the workspace. This is about you individually as a worker and what you put out to the world. A person in this space might provide essential mentorship or actively engage in conversations that are uncomfortable or difficult. It encompasses anything that you do as an individual that outwardly impacts someone other than yourself. Next slide. In this individual and internal quadrant is the space where we'll find the work an individual does to seek out education and to mitigate their own prejudices and biases. This space is the most personal work that you'll do. It's about understanding your own identities, confronting your privileges and biases, and finding a productive way for you to move forward through the discomfort of unearthing all of that to be able to learn and grow. It's also about holding yourself accountable to ways of being open to learning more and to learning from different people. Next slide. And then finally, we have the institutional internal quadrant. And in this space, you'll find the work an organization does to create an inclusive workplace. And this can run the gamut from how an organization functions, to how it hires and trains people, to how it supports new ideas from different people on staff. In short, you're thinking about how does your organization create and foster an inclusive culture. Next slide. In general, this entire framework, thinking about equity, diversity, and inclusion, using this framework will make sure that you are going through all of the different quadrants and you are engaging in the work on many different levels. The self-evaluation tool we're going to talk about today is focused primarily in the institutional or the organizational quadrants and is about moving your organization forward into incorporating equitable and inclusive practices. However, there are spaces and opportunities for individual reflection in this tool as well. So you will be able to engage on both an organizational level and an individual level. Next slide. The purpose of the cultural responsiveness self-evaluation tool is to support outdoor school programs in becoming more culturally responsive, which is a huge part of making outdoor school more equitable and inclusive. So what does that really mean? What does it mean to be culturally responsive? The first step to answering that question is to define what it means when we say, what we mean when we say culture. And I'm going to pass that on to Spirit to give us some more information.
So before we dive into how to use the tool and the components of the tool, it's really important that we understand how culture is centered in the cultural responsiveness self-evaluation tool. So we think by centering students' cultures in outdoor school spaces, in the classroom, in both formal and non-formal settings, we're rejecting a deficit view of culture and recognizing and celebrating students' personal experiences as valid and powerful sources of knowledge. So culture refers to the ways of living, shared behaviors, beliefs, customs, values, and ways of knowing that guide groups of people in their daily life and are transmitted from one generation to the next. Culture affects how people learn, remember, reason, solve problems, and communicate. And culture is part and parcel of students' intellectual and social development. And understanding how aspects of cultures can vary shed light on variations in how students learn. And this is very important. Next slide, please. So the tool itself is rooted in the principles of culturally responsive education, which is a framework that recognizes the importance of including students' cultural references in all aspects of learning. Culturally responsive education is about teaching the student in front of you. And we rooted the tool in the 8 principles of culturally responsive education. So the first is a communication of high expectations. The second is using active teaching methods. The third, the practitioner as facilitator. The fourth is how to include culturally and linguistically diverse students. 5 is cultural sensitivity. 6 is reshaping the curriculum or how services are delivered to students. 7, student-controlled discourse, and 8, small group instruction. So these are the 8 principles of culturally responsive education that we consistently touched back to as we were building the tool. Next slide. So the big question is, how do we shift the principles and practices of culturally responsive education from K-12 contexts to the outdoor school context? And we really thought about how culturally responsive outdoor school programs should create an environment where everyone can feel welcome, safe, respected, included, and free to participate in all aspects of outdoor school as their authentic whole selves. How we could foster positive experiences for all students by exposing and eliminating institutional policies and structures that uphold systems of power and privilege, and in doing so, how we might meet the needs of each unique community in Oregon. And slide.
So I'm going to take it from here. Thanks, Spirit. So I want to re-say a couple things about the purpose as I move through a little bit more of an introduction before we dive in. So I'd like to frame this in regards to two things. First, the goal is to help organizations be more, and I want to highlight the word more, culturally responsive, which recognizes that we all have space to grow rather than achieve some standard of cultural responsiveness, perhaps akin to the term cultural competence, which we're pushing back and I get a little with this. Really, it's designed to respectfully meet programs and people where they are and has been developed for a full state where folks are coming from a lot of different places. Next, I want to frame it in terms of evaluation to learning. So reflection and planning is learning. And then to practice, which is implementation. This is not evaluation for reporting or performance. I'm going to say a couple more things here, which is going to be a little redundant, but I want you to really hear these things. So the CRSET seeks to facilitate critical reflection and subsequently support organizations to make attainable changes to its program, organization, individual, beliefs, or systems. And all of these are directed towards equity, diversity, inclusion. To reference the slides that Sharzi just talked us through, we're trying to support organizations and individuals to tackle this blob. And this is really messy work. Another way to say it is that the purpose is to help organizations operationalize equity work, which can occur across many different scales: internal, external, individual, or organizational. And one last little note, bullet points 1 and 2, the self-evaluation and reflection and planning, are explicitly covered in this publication, while bullet 3 does not. And that happens, of course, in your communities. We'll touch back on that. You can go to the next slide. First, I want to just remind everyone of evaluative thinking and break down this cycle with some examples. So in the upper left, number 1, we have evaluation. The examples here in terms of Oregon Outdoor School. So with the CRSET, this is the first half of the pages where you evaluate what you do. Another example, for those of you who utilize the outcome-based surveys at the end of your program, this is also evaluation. Next, moving to the second point, reflection and planning. This is professional development or action planning. And again, examples here, the second half of the CRSET, or targeted professional development. And then number 3 is where we engage in implementation of programming. And this could look like community engagement or culturally responsive programming. And I want to highlight here that all of this is driven by the core value of equity. 3 little points I want to stress. First, this idea that this is an ongoing process with iteration and reflection throughout. Next, evaluation to learning to practice. This is not evaluation for reporting or performance. Thus, in terms of the statewide program, professional development and evaluation efforts are very much aligned. I want to highlight the need to engage with this work with humbleness and a growth mindset. And then finally, just cover that evaluation is not a dirty word. And for some, it might bring about thoughts about grades, but this is about growth and not grades. And so for those of you who do ever decide to share your results in a professional development setting, I just want to stress that in the case with all these evaluative tools we offer, that results will not be used as punitive measures to funding. You can go to the next, Christy. Another piece I want to highlight here is the difference between input or process level evaluation and outcome level evaluation. So when we think about outcomes, for those of you who participate in the student outcomes, sometimes called Common Measures project, This is where we evaluate what happens as a result of our programming. This is kind of like the effect, but not exactly. This tool, the CRSET on the left, input level evaluation, is where we evaluate what we do. Kind of like the cause, but really more antecedent. The metaphor I like to think about here is that when we're talking outcome level evaluation, we're evaluating the signal, whatever happens because of what we do. Input level is the tower throwing up that signal. Yeah, you can advance. So again, the CRSET focuses on input level evaluation. So we're going to start, and I'm going to pass it off to Christy. We're going to start with this first point, self-evaluating what we're doing in relation to cultural responsiveness, rather than evaluating what results from what we're doing.
Thanks, Steve.
Mm-hmm.
So as Sharzi sort of set us up with at the beginning, a lot of this work is very messy and complex. And so one of the goals of this tool is to sort of try to break that down into more manageable chunks that we can actually tackle and do something with. And so I'm going to describe here how the tool is structured so that once you actually start to explore sort of all the details in the tool, you'll have this big picture idea of how it operates. So the basic unit that it's divided into are these 3 themes of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And they're color coded here on the slide, and the color coding in the document itself matches exactly with these. And then within each theme, it breaks it down into multiple characteristics. So if we look at this equity theme, within that theme, we have 5 characteristics. So organizational identity, community-specific histories, beliefs, and norms, internal organizational activities, educational programming, and external organizational activities. And so within each of the 3 themes, we find these more specific ideas on which we can reflect about our program. And so then it goes down even one piece further. For each one of these characteristics, there are qualifiers. So I'm going to focus in on internal organizational activities, which is in this equity theme. So this is sort of a snapshot of what the document looks like. If you're familiar with our instructional resource self-evaluation tool, this perhaps looks familiar to you. So what you'll see is the theme up there at the top of equity. The characteristic is all the way over on the left. So here, internal organizational activities, we're talking about those things like policies and practices, like your strategic plan, your staff work plans, your hiring plans, your position descriptions, all of those sorts of things that you do internally as an organization. And that's what this characteristic is about. And so we then have 3 qualifiers. So absent, here is the second column over, then emerging in the middle, and highly effective over on the right. And so these are really designed to help you reflect on your program and think about what aspects of this characteristic might be absent, emerging, or highly effective. And I want to mention it was a very deliberate choice to use absent, emerging, highly effective rather than, for example, a score of 0, a score of 1, a score of 2. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is because once you start putting numbers on things, you're essentially assigning equal value or equal weight to all of the different aspects, all the different characteristics in the tool, where some of your programs might put higher weight on individual characteristics rather than others. And also, we're trying to get away from this idea of there being an overall score that shows sort of how your program is doing, and to sort of embrace this mindset that we're all constantly learning and growing and pushing, and we all have room to grow no matter how much we've been engaged in this work. And so that's why we see these things marked as absent, emerging, and highly effective rather than being marked with numbers. And then all the way over on the right, there's a column for recording evidence. So as you were going through and reflecting on the internal organizational activities of your program, you would note in this column evidence that you can find that supports the way that you qualified it as absent, emerging, or highly effective. And then finally, you'll see down here on the bottom is an individual reflection question. And so as Sharzi mentioned, the tool is mostly set up for organizational reflection, but there are some pieces of individual reflection built in here as well. And I'll make a quick note that there's an asterisk at the bottom indicating words that are in a glossary that accompanies this tool, which we will introduce to you here at the end. So what we would like to do is take a couple moments of, I will stop talking, for you to read through this particular characteristic of internal organizational activities and actually think about your own outdoor school program or organization and try to qualify it, go through this process so that you'll have an opportunity to ask us questions here if there's anything that sort of trips you up as you go through the process. So I'm going to pause just for a couple moments to let you try your hand at running through that, and then also to consider that individual reflection question. So I will mute myself and I will time myself and come back here in about 2 minutes. I'll give you another moment or two, but I'd like to invite you, if you have any questions about the process of qualifying your program or organization, or questions about how the individual reflection sort of fits into it all, we would invite you to put those into the Q&A or send them to us in the chat so that we can get those questions answered. All right, Sharzi, I don't see anything coming in, though my screen's a bit blocked with the screen share. Do we have any questions that have come in?
No, not yet.
Okay, sounds good, thanks. So we will note, we're just going through one characteristic here as you actually go through the process of digging into the full document. As questions come up, we will be more than happy to answer those. as well as for people who are watching on the webinar recording who don't have live access to us right now. You can always email us at outdoorschool@oregonstate.edu with questions basically about anything related to outdoor school, and we will get you to the right person through that email address and can get you support in using this tool with your team. I'm going to briefly go over the other two themes. We're not going to take a close look at one of the characteristics in those, but just to sort of give you a sense for the scope of the document. And so equity was that first theme. The second theme is diversity, and the third theme is inclusion. So within the diversity theme, we have staffing and workforce diversity, community and student participation, diverse educational and learning materials, ideas, and experiences, and this idea of seeing diversity as an asset. And then within the inclusion theme, we have 4 more characteristics about accessibility, differentiated instruction, targeted or culturally specific program content, and inclusive collaborations and partnerships. And so that's sort of an overview of the basic structure of the document. And so for every one of these characteristics, you will have the description as well as the absent, emerging, and highly effective, those bullet points under there that provide a little bit more detail to guide you in qualifying your organization. And so now that we've sort of gone over the structure, I'm going to talk a little bit about the process of using this tool with your team. So the first step would, of course, be to gather team members representing a variety of roles. And we have some more details about this in the document itself. But one thing that we really recommend is that you have someone in leadership involved in this process who actually has the power and agency to sort of take things to the next step as you go through this process. The second step would be think about all these people that you've pulled together on this team. What's their current understanding of equity, diversity, and inclusion? Do they have a baseline understanding that will sort of allow them to move through the document, or might you need to do a little bit of pre-work? And so we have a couple of suggestions in the document as well for what that might look like. The third step is to then read through each characteristic, sort of like you just did with internal organizational activities, and actually qualify it. And so take notes in that evidence section so that when you come back together to discuss it, you have specific things that you can point to. And then where there are those individual reflection questions, you would invite team members to reflect on those. And so we do have there's basically like a tips for using the tool page in the actual document that goes through some things you might want to think about. For example, around how people might participate if someone who has power over their employment is in the room. And so some of those sort of things to consider. The next step is to hold a team meeting and share notes and discuss. And this is a really short point as it's appearing on the screen here, but like this is where so much of the meat of this work really happens. That the point of this team meeting is not to agree and decide on exactly where your organization falls, but the real work is actually happening in those conversations that you're having with your team. And then the final step that's within the tool is to use the cultural responsiveness report, reflection, and improvement plan to evaluate and reflect on each of the characteristics relative to EDI. And so we haven't really talked about this plan piece that's showing up here in number 6 yet, and it definitely deserves a little bit of unpacking. And so I'm going to pass it off to Steve to sort of do some of that unpacking and give us some more info about that.
Thanks, Christy. So yeah, I want to connect that plan, but also that meeting. So that was points 5 and 6 that Christy just covered to this next part of the evaluation cycle. So forgive me, I'm confusing some numbers here, but this is number 2, right? In the upper right, where we reflect, connect, learn, and plan. This is the second stage of evaluation and starts on page 14. So I invite you to all go there if you're following along with the CRSET as well. And you can go to the next page, Christy. Okay, so here, the cultural responsiveness report, reflection, and improvement plan. Um, Here's where you can tally your team's qualifiers and try to get a broad picture of your organization from different perspectives. I want you to expect to see and fully embrace differences here. Everyone has different truths. And a lot of that comes from our perspective, our identity, our context, our privilege. It's really important to recognize issues of power and safety here and to seek to mediate these issues. So perhaps you might want to allow anonymous reporting. And as you go through this with your team, could imagine you have multiple checkboxes. Some folks might think structural identity is emerging. Other folks might see it as highly effective, and still might see it as absent. Um, it's important not to question individuals on their qualifications if, in fact, you know who has qualified what, but rather to discuss observations and really respectfully seek to understand. You can go to the next. This next page, I want to explain the structure here. So in the top, on the left, is the kind of Uber reflection. So here's where your team identifies a characteristic or characteristics to target. On the right, you want to think about moving forward to address these targeted characteristics. What challenges might you expect, and how could you deal with them? And on the bottom, this is really just a pretty basic, simple improvement plan. First, you set a goal. Then you make a clear objective, whatever that change is that needs to occur. And then you identify those actions needed to achieve and who will be responsible for it. So really trying to just move that evaluative thinking into practice, which brings me to the next slide. Here, back to the evaluation cycle. Again, equity is centered and drives everything. This is where we shift to this third part of the cycle before we resume it or begin it again. Of course, this occurs in your respective communities. And really, these are all the incredible things you do as outdoor educators and could include outdoor school programming, facility upgrades or modifications, community engagement, strategic planning, modifying your curriculum, or updating your materials like your website or your staff policies. Again, super multifaceted work tackling the blob here. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Sharzi.
Thanks, Steve. So now that we've talked about how the Cultural Responsiveness Self-Evaluation Tool, or CRSET, is designed to help you move through the evaluation cycle, I want to share with you some things to keep in mind when you're using the CRSET. First off, all outdoor school programs should expect to have areas of growth. As Christy and Steve have already iterated, whether you're brand new to equity work or if you've been engaged in this work for years, everyone will see growth because we are always learning about new identities, new folks, and how those folks want to be treated, what language they'd like to be associated with them. That's always changing. There is no fixed point when we're talking about cultural responsiveness. So there will always be growth happening, regardless of how engaged you've been in this process. Cultural responsiveness is a continual learning and development process. The intent of this tool is not to standardize the outdoor school experience or to shame the organization, nor will it be used in a punitive fashion related to funding. Next slide. The overall goal of this work is equity in student outcomes reached through high quality, culturally responsive programming. The goal is not to score or grade. That is not what we're talking about. And it's definitely not to think about how to use this tool correctly. And just sometimes when people focus on whether they're using a tool correctly, they're doing that because it's easier. It's easier to think of something as a checklist than to actually dive deep into the tough and complex issues that show up, particularly that will be showing up in this tool. We encourage you to always keep the goal of this work in mind And if you're using this tool in a way that leads you to honest reflection about your program, that's what matters. Don't get hung up on the small stuff. Think about the honest reflection coming from your staff members, yourself, as you're thinking about your program. As you do this work, you will likely find yourself pushing into areas that are uncomfortable and where you have a lot to learn. This is a sign that you're doing the work. That is a good sign. We want to make sure that you feel supported as you go through this process. So Christy is going to share some of the resources that we've pulled together that might be useful as you learn and as you grow, especially as you're using this tool.
Thanks, Sharzi. So we recognize that this is pushing everyone. It's pushing our team as well into our learning edges to learn and grow. And so we have compiled some resources that might be useful to you as you go through the process, either as you're using the tool or once you go through that process that Steve just described of selecting some characteristics that you really want to focus on and target for improvement. You might use these resources for that as well. So let's see if I can get, are you able to see me on our website? Awesome. Okay, great. So we have a new website page dedicated to this particular tool. And so this is where you will be able to come to download the tool itself. You can get to this. Sharzi will put the link in the chat, but you can get to this from our homepage. There's a banner at the top that says what's new at Outdoor School. And one of the buttons on that banner is Cultural Responsiveness Self-Evaluation Tool. So if you lose the link, just head to our homepage and you can get to it from there. So you can click on here to view and download the tool itself. We'll be posting the recording of this webinar, which none of you are visible on, just FYI, into this space with captions by Monday. So if anyone on your team is interested in watching, or if you want to watch some piece over again, you'll be able to do that here. And then finally, what I mostly want to talk about is the CRSET resource page. So I'm going to click on here. And so the first thing I will point out is that there is a glossary associated with these tools. And so up here, if I click on the glossary, it goes through a bunch of different words that we use in these tools that may be new or slightly unfamiliar to you. So for example, one of the characteristics I mentioned was thinking about diversity as an asset. Maybe that's a new idea to you, and so you might want to read more about asset models here in the glossary. Most of this resource page is dedicated to a curated list of resources about every single characteristic in the document. So here's the equity theme up here at the top with its 5 characteristics, the diversity theme with its 4 characteristics, and then the inclusion theme with its 4 characteristics. And I'm going to click, since internal organizational activities is the characteristic that you looked at in a little bit of detail, I'm going to click on this. So once you click on that characteristic, it's going to pop down a list of resources with a little bit of information about what's in that resource that might be useful to you as you're thinking about that characteristic. So if you come upon a characteristic that's unfamiliar to you and you feel like I need a little bit more information before I can, self-evaluate and reflect on how our program is doing on this, you might come here. But what we imagine probably most people will use this for is, okay, I have identified that our internal organizational activities need some work and we have lots of room for improvement. We're going to come here and we're going to use this as a starting place to sort of dig our teeth into doing that work. And so you can find through, I won't click through them all for you, you can check that out on your own time. For any of the characteristics, there are a few resources for you to check out there. And I'm going to take us back here and note that this tool is just one part of our work to support equitable and inclusive outdoor school programs for Oregon students. So we have been talking in basically every part of our work about how do we advance equity in outdoor school. And so we really encourage you to think of this as just one step in that process, whether you're brand new and this is going to be your first step to doing that explicit equity work, or whether this might contribute to work that you've been doing for years, as Sharzi said. We encourage you to think about using this tool to advance that work. And on December 1st, we're going to be rolling out equity and inclusion, a call for equity and inclusion grant proposals, which will provide funds for programs to actually put some of this work on the ground. And so it's our hope and recommendation that this self-evaluation tool will play a key role in that process for lots of programs to actually do that deep reflection work about where is your program coming from, where is it now, so that you can really target the areas that you want to focus on improving so that you can have sort of the biggest effect for students. And so that, I think, is our last main content slide. We do want to save some time here. It looks like we have about 8 minutes for any questions that people have, either about the specifics of the tool, how this fits into larger work, really anything directly or tangentially related to this tool. We would love to hear your questions. So we'll pause for a moment for those to come in if you have any. So I see a comment here in the chat that's been addressed in the chat, but in case anyone is not following that, and especially for folks watching the recording, there's a suggestion that perhaps we provide some case studies of schools and specifics so that outdoor schools can see how this actually, these characteristics are operating in action. And thank you for that suggestion. That's absolutely something that we're planning to do. It wasn't something that we could quite get rolling here for the launch of the tool, but we do have plans to do that. And that's something, as Spirit mentioned in the chat, we actually piloted this tool with a group of outdoor school programs, and that was one of their suggestions as well. And so we acknowledge that that will be super useful to people, and we are working on it.
Christy, there's another question in the chat regarding the grant opportunity. Is it expected that organizations try and approach the tool prior to submitting requests, or that it is part of the process as a whole? I can imagine the second provides more time and thoughtful reflection, and that's from Amy Carlo.
Thanks, Spirit. My understanding, but more information will come out when the call comes out on December 1st. My understanding is that you might propose using the CRSET as part of the work that you're requesting funding for. That we wouldn't, it's essentially not a prerequisite to requesting funding. And if that didn't quite answer it, Amy, feel free to ask a clarifying question in the chat.
And hopefully that answered Dan Prince's question of how do you see the CRSET and the grants program interacting? And then Catherine asks if we're planning to provide the CRSET in different languages.
I do not know that I have the answer to that. Spirit, Steve, Sharzi, do you have thoughts on that?
I think we are planning to have that translated and provide it in different languages as well. So yes, that would be a yes, Catherine. We try to do that with all of our materials. So that's an important question, and the answer is yes.
I think I'd add too, if you as a program provider or leader know of a particular language that is a priority for us to translate for, it would be helpful for us to know what those languages are, recognizing it does take time. And so let us know, please. That would be helpful.
Yeah, and our other materials get translated into 7 different languages plus Braille. Is that right, Sharissa? Did I forget?
Yep. No, that's correct. So there are Just like Spirit said, we try and ensure that all of our general information gets translated into the 7 languages plus the Braille that we have. But if you have a language that we don't translate into, that's something to reach out to us and let us know about.
Next question. How about a couple of specific tips, tricks, lessons learned that seem to be good places to start in growing in responsiveness in teams with a little experience, even in your team personally and professionally? I think I can start just with our team at the OSU level. I think once we had everyone hired, one of the very first things we did as a team was collaborate on creation of our mission, vision, and core values as an organization. And in doing that work in a retreat together, we really were able to articulate just how much equity was important for us to center in all of our work individually, but also in our work as an organization. So if folks can find time to sit together for half a day or a day to begin, I think that's a really good place to start at the organizational level.
Thanks, Spirit. And I'll note, Lacey, that many of the resources that we've included on that resource page include specific case studies and examples in them. So as we're in the process where there's the lag between us recognizing that we want to provide case studies and us actually being able to get that rolling, you might check out some of those resources. In our last 3 minutes, any other questions? Okay. So we'd like to thank you again for taking the time to join us today and for engaging in this work. Our emails are up here if you want to get in touch with any of us individually, or you are always welcome to email outdoorschool@oregonstate.edu, and we can direct your questions to the right person. If you feel that you need some extra support in using this tool with your team, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're so happy to help people. We put who knows how many hours into developing this. Like, we want people to use it. And so however we can support you in making that happen, we are happy to do it. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We really appreciate you joining us today. So
thank you. And just one last thing to highlight. This is one of a suite of self-evaluation tools that we're planning on rolling out. The next one will be likely the beginning of January, and that's a special education and accessibility self-evaluation tool. And I will also add, while we centered outdoor school in how we were thinking about this tool really is geared towards outdoor and experiential education more generally. So it's a tool that's meant to be used for other types of programs as well.
All right, 11:59. Thanks everyone for joining us, and have a lovely day.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.